Welcome to another video from explainingcomputers.com. This time I've invested in one of these, a MicroSD Express card along with a compatible reader. SD Express brings a PCIe NVMe interface to SD cards, significantly increasing data transfer speeds. The SD Express interface standard was first introduced back in 2018, although since that time it's not been widely adopted. However, the Nintendo Switch 2 now uses MicroSD Express, so igniting a fresh interest. And I therefore thought it was a good time to make a video all about SD Express, including testing out some specific hardware. So let's go and take a closer look. Right, here we have our MicroSD Express card, which is a 256GB SanDisk model that cost me £49.99 on Amazon UK and currently sells on Amazon US for $71.99. And as we can see, the card has a claimed maximum read speed of 880MB a second, maximum write of 650MB a second, and a sustained write of 210MB a second. And so, in theory, on some measures, this card is over 8 times faster than a standard UHS-I SD card. This was also the easiest card for me to find in stock so I could actually buy it, and just before we open it up, I thought we'd have a quick summary of alternatives. In addition to our 256GB card, SanDisk also offers a 128GB version as well as a 256GB model specifically licensed for the Nintendo Switch 2. A similar Switch 2 licensed card has been launched by Samsung, whilst PNY have cards in 128 and 256GB capacities. And then finally, as far as I can find, we have Lexar, who list new MicroSD Express cards in 256GB, 512GB and 1TB capacities. Although, at the time of making this video, the Lexar cards don't seem to be on sale. It's also important to note that MicroSD Express cards from different manufacturers have somewhat different published specifications and claimed performance, and I'll talk more about this later in the video. But for now, let's open up our Samsung card. I think we just rip the top like that. We do. That will get us in. Very exciting. And there we are. There is our card. Let's just get to it. There we go. And if we cut into a close-up and turn it over like that, we can see it has 2 rows of connection pins. However, this does not make SD Express cards unique. And so I think it's wise to have a quick summary of available SD card standards. Nine official SD bus interface standards have so far been specified by the SD Association. And some proprietary standards, such as SanDisk QuickFlow, are also on the market. Each of these interfaces specifies the speed of electronics and the physical pins used to transfer data, and I've covered all of them in my video Explaining SD Cards 2025 update. However, many of these standards are either quite old or have not been implemented in real hardware. And so here, let's focus on the 4 SD interfaces in common use. Today, most SD cards have an ultra-high speed 1 or UHS-I interface. This uses a single row of pins and can transfer data at up to 104 megabytes a second. SanDisk and some other manufacturers have also implemented proprietary technologies to boost the speed of UHS-I cards in their own readers. However, the next official interface standard is UHS-II, which can transfer data at up to 312 megabytes a second. Here, the UHS-II interface uses a second row of pins, with the top row maintained to provide a UHS-I interface for backwards compatibility. Finally, we have the first of 4 currently specified standards for SD Express, technically known as SD Express PCIe Gen 3x1. This again retains a top row of pins for a legacy UHS-I interface, but uses a second row of pins for a single lane PCIe 3.0 interface with a maximum theoretical data transfer speed of 985 megabytes a second. It is, however, very important to note that the second row of pins on an SD Express card is not backwards compatible with UHS-II, as it uses an entirely different interface. And indeed, if we compare three real microSD cards with UHS-I, UHS-II and SD Express interface, we can see that the second row of pins on the SD Express card is very slightly smaller than that on the UHS-II card. Backwards compatibility is maintained for all three cards via the UHS-I top row of pins. But the UHS-II card can only be accessed at full speed in the UHS-II device, and an SD Express card can only be accessed at full speed in an SD Express device. And so the upgrade route for anybody who currently uses UHS-II is a bit of a mess. Just in case you're wondering, the three other SD Express interface standards increase the maximum data transfer speed to nearly 4,000 megabytes a second by moving to PCIe 4.0 and adding a third row of pins for an extra PCIe lane. But only the first version of SD Express is actually on the market, and so let's return to our real hardware. Greetings! Shall we take a look at our new SD Express reader? This is again from SanDisk, as we can see, has got both SD and microSD card slots and connects to a computer using a USB 3.2 Gen 2 interface. This provides a 10 gigabits per second USB connection, which is 1250 megabytes a second, and so can accommodate the maximum speed of a microSD Express card. But do be aware that if a computer does not have a Type A or Type C USB 3.2 Gen 2 port, or a USB 4 port, or a Thunderbolt port, then it won't be able to use a reader like this to access a microSD Express card, or indeed an SD Express card, at its full speed. Now, hopefully you're sitting down right now, as this cost me £83.99. And it's currently selling on Amazon.com for $107.99. So let's bring in Stanley the knife and open it up. I think we just flick it over like that and cut through a piece of tape, and hopefully we can get inside. Now the wrong way up, and we get in. There we are. I was about to say it looks very nice. It should do for this price, shouldn't it? Quite heavy, and there we are. This is our device. Anything else in the box? We also get a USB cable. That's hardly a surprise. And so I think we're now all prepared to run some tests. Greetings! I've now plugged our SD Express reader into my i3-10400F PC and inserted the microSD Express card. This activates no less than 3 LEDs, so we can see where at least some of the money goes. And over here in Windows, I thought we'd start with a CrystalDiskMark test, so let's click all to start things off and use the magic of filmmaking to speed on through. And there we are, and I almost can't believe it, but we've got a headline read speed of 899 megabytes a second and a write speed of 650 megabytes a second for a microSD card, which is certainly very fast indeed. And let's add the figures to a table that includes the results for a 256 gigabyte SanDisk Extreme Pro UHS-I card, for the same UHS-I card in a QuickFlow reader, and for a 64 gigabyte UHS-II card. And here I think the figures really speak for themselves, with SD Express clearly delivering a step change in data transfer speed. Next, we're going to do a real-world test copying 50.6 gigabytes of ProRes video files to and from our microSD card. Although, just before we do the tests, let's return to the earlier table where I listed the specifications of cards from different manufacturers. And my learning point here was how difficult it was to obtain the data. And I did spend quite a lot of time finding datasheets and will include relevant links in the video description. But in the end, only the SanDisk card we're testing has published figures for claimed read, write and sustained write performance, with the SanDisk licensed Nintendo Switch 2 card publishing no performance data at all. The Samsung licensed card then only publishes a claimed read speed together with the 30 and U3 speed class ratings, which mean that a sustained write speed of 30 megabytes a second is guaranteed. This is also the only sustained write indication provided for the PNY and Lexar cards. And of course their sustained write performance may be far higher, but we just don't have any claimed figures from the manufacturers, which really makes me wonder what they're not keen to reveal. It's also worth noting that in October 2023 the SD Association defined 4 SD Express speed classes, as we can see in this table from my 2025 SD card video. And yet none of the MicroSD Express cards currently sold or announced by manufacturer is credited with an SD Express speed class, which again for me sets alarm bells ringing. And so, in my view, unless SD Express is only intended to remain a niche storage media for games consoles, most manufacturers need to start publishing far more comprehensive claimed performance data. This all said, let's now perform our real-world test. We will copy these files, all 50.6 gigabytes of them, and paste them to our MicroSD Express card. And I'll bring in a clock so we can time things before I press paste like that. And we'll keep an eye on things as they go through. I'm particularly interested in the sustained write speed. And oh look, it's fallen down pretty quickly, hasn't it? To about 200 megabytes a second, which to be fair is exactly what SanDisk claim for the card. But again, it makes me think about what those other cards, what is their sustained write speed? It is so critical for media where you're likely to be working with a lot of data. Anyway, I think we should now speed on through. And there we are, it's finished, although by the magic of filmmaking, we've kept the graph on the screen. And the 50.6 gigabyte copy completed in 352, which is about 223 megabytes a second, largely determined by the sustained write speed of about 217 megabytes a second, which we descended towards after the first few gigabytes. And in case you're interested, earlier I ran the same test for a UHS-II card, which completed in 317, equating to 263 megabytes a second, but with the write speed being constant throughout the copy. Finally, after a restart to ensure that all buffers are flushed, let's try copying the files back from the microSD card to an NVMe SSD on the PC, which we would expect to be much faster. And there we are, it's finished in 124, equating to 616 megabytes a second. And admittedly, this is only about 2/3 of the read speed we measured in CrystalDiskMark, but this is why we do real-world tests. And this is certainly a very practical thing you might actually do with a card like this, copying video files from it to an NVMe SSD on a PC. And I think the result of 616 megabytes a second is very impressive indeed. Now, before we wrap, I thought I'd anticipate a couple of questions. And the first is, how can a microSD card operate at these speeds without overheating? Well, in use, the case of the reader certainly gets a little warm. And indeed the back of its box does state that an aluminium core helps to keep the card cool. In October 2023, the SD 9.1 specification also introduced thermal management, which empowers the host to adequately control the card's internal temperature to maintain the target recording speed class. The datasheet for our SanDisk card also refers to the inclusion of thermodapt technology to help keep devices from overheating with a specifically designed enclosure and controller that uses dynamic adaptive thermal management. And I also found this further information on Thermadapt, which indicates that SanDisk MicroSD Express cards are encased in a high thermal conductive substrate to allow heat to be dissipated to the read-write hardware. And I understand that other manufacturers have similar solutions in place. Secondly, you may be wondering about the application of an SD Express card if you don't have a Nintendo Switch 2. Well, whilst no camera or other device I'm aware of has an SD Express interface, existing hardware can write to SD Express media over its legacy UHS-I interface. And indeed, I've now recorded video to our test MicroSD Express card by putting it in a full-size SD UHS-I adapter and using it in cameras from Sony, Canon and Panasonic. And I've also tested the card recording video to a Blackmagic Design HDMI recorder, which will save a lot of time when downloading files. As we've seen, SD Express is a step-change technology that offers the highest read speed of any kind of SD card media. And potentially SD Express could also offer the highest sustained write speed, although this isn't a feature of any existing product I can find. Now, absolutely, right now, SD Express cards and readers are very expensive. But the cards are typically less expensive than comparably branded UHS-II cards. And so SD Express is already worth considering for use in cameras and video recording devices if the high sustained write speeds currently available from UHS-II are not required, and very high speed reading from the cards, very high speed download from the cards will be significantly beneficial. But now that's it for another video. If you've enjoyed what you've seen here, please press that like button. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe, and I hope to talk to you again very soon.